12. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this Lunch and Learn. I think we are on month 6 or Lunch and Learn number 6 now, I think. So really pleased with how this is all going. Thank you for everybody that attends everyone religiously. For those watching on playback, thank you for watching on our YouTube channel. Please tell all your friends, and if you can come along to the live events in future, that would be great. And I'll plug the next one at the end, but just so I do it now so I don't forget. First Thursday of November, so I think it's the 6th of November will be the next one. And once you're in our mailing list, we will send you information about upcoming Lunch and Learns and the subject matter. Also, if anybody has topic ideas that you want to talk about, then please do let us know either in the chat or via email. And also, if it's something that you feel passionate about and you would like to come on and speak about, again, please let us know. So without further ado, let's move on. So today is evacuate, decant, or prohibit. Something that I've spent a lot of time, or probably way too much time, talking about on the media and on LinkedIn, etc. But then simultaneously, not enough time talking about. This is something that is front and center in the building safety crisis and is largely untracked in terms of the volume of buildings that are being decanted, prohibited, evacuated, etc., due to fire and structural safety issues. We do our best to try and track it, and we'll come on and talk about that in more detail later. But it is largely undiscussed, unseen part of the crisis that we're all involved in helping to manage, or in some cases are living through as residents. So moving on, I'm delighted to be joined by Melisa White today. I'll call her Mel for the purposes of this. That's how I call her. Full name is Melisa, and she is both the founder of a company called KindStay, but is also I won't use the term victim, has been on the receiving end of a prohibition notice in her own personal life, and this is really what's brought her to this discussion today. So Mel, probably over to you just to give everybody a sort of an overview of who you are, what you did before, and how you've ended up today talking with me about this subject.
Thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. So I came from the technology space and moved to the UK to support my grandparents, and was really amazed at some of their issues and challenges as leaseholders and the lack of information and knowledge and support that they had. So I set up a company a few years ago after my grandfather passed to help leaseholders get access to information that they need about their properties. And then through the evacuation, so I've become very familiar with properties in general, but it was through the evacuation that happened a few months ago that I became intimately familiar with this particular situation and the decants. And so I set up KindStay, one, to support local landlords so that they could provide emergency accommodation for residents in their area that were needing safe, secure, high quality homes. And the other side was, and the more important side was, to support the well-being of all the residents that are affected through either building remediation, cladding, or the evacuation side, to residents suffering with damp and mold in their properties. The Wellness Hub is really all about giving people tools to proactively focus on what they can control and try their best to maintain a healthy mindset when they're going through disruption and anxiety and change.
Fantastic, thanks, Mel. We'll go into more detail about that as we go on. So that's a really great overview. The whole subject about decants, we just call them decants for shorthand at the moment, is one that I started looking into in detail with my team in early 2021, and that was really as a result of, okay, so if a building safety issue gets to a point where safety is no longer guaranteed or tolerable, there are powers of prohibition that exist, and we'll go through the legal powers in a minute. But we started asking the question within our team about, well, okay, this is a theoretical possibility, but how often is it actually happening? Is this actually happening, or are we just getting overexcited about the subject. So we set about looking to say, well, where can we get this information from? And that led us down a path of enforcement registers for the fire service, which are split up into an FCC sort of national enforcement register, which has a number of problems with it and a number of data integrity issues. And then London Fire Brigade have their own. They all talk about system, the prohibitions in different way. The London described things differently to the rest of the country, but ultimately it didn't really actually definitively tell you this building was prohibited, and that led to 420 residents being moved out for an indefinite period of time, which is the question that we were trying to answer. How often was this happening? So the way that we did it is we started looking for press reporting. And that led to what we now call our post-Grenfell prohibition timeline or prohibition tracker, which I've linked to in the notes, and we'll talk about in a minute in more detail. But ultimately, what that led to was actually sort of saying, well, actually, there is a pattern emerging here. Why are these buildings being prohibited? Who's doing it? Is it for fire reasons or structural reasons or both? Those sorts of questions, and that led to a lot of press interest. And it seems to be becoming bit more sort of de rigueur these days. Pete Apps has just written about this and published something in the last few days in Inside Housing. I was on the BBC a couple of weeks ago that went out about prohibitions in Liverpool and Worcester. And the thesis that hasn't really been proved yet is that as more and more buildings are investigated as a result of the Building Safety Act, Fire Safety England regs, etc., remediation, will more and more intolerable issues be identified and therefore lead to more and more prohibition. The other driver of prohibition, which again we haven't seen yet but is potential, is to do with the very high failure rate or refusal rate of building assessment certificates for the higher risk buildings. So that's running at about 75% refusal rate at the moment. The data behind that isn't published yet. But will that tip over into an increased rate of prohibition or decants of buildings? Very early days of that at the moment, but potentially we are starting to see sort of planned decants. For example, in Croydon, there's a large one at the moment with Legal and General, which is not on our register yet because that's actually going to kick in the early part of next year. We're hearing about rolling decants within remediation projects. So I think residents being moved out of their homes as a result of the building safety crisis for some reason, I still firmly believe that incidents will increase. And that's part of the reason of having this conversation today, to say, what will the people that run these buildings or are responsible for managing these buildings, what services and support will be put in place to manage this process, but also support the residents that are on the receiving end of these orders or these notifications. So, Mel, this is how we met, wasn't it? Because I think I'd posted something about your buildings being decanted, and I think you popped up on LinkedIn saying, "Hey, I'm a person that's been decanted from a building. This is what happened to me." And then we ended up speaking. So, were you aware of this going on prior to it happening to you? Had this sort of reached you as an issue?
So we knew that there were cladding issues. I live in a marina in Southampton, and we knew that the entire marina was populated with buildings that had cladding issues. It was only when remediation had started on a neighboring block that when they started the works, everything just stopped. And for about 6 months, nothing happened. There were no people. And then we found out that actually there were structural issues to the fireproofing of the steel. Not widely talked about, but just because of my relationship with a lot of the leaseholders, I got to understand that. And that they were doing everything they could to not. So our neighbors got evacuated with 6 hours notice. And we're just told, you've got to leave your property. And so maybe 4 months later, we got slips of paper under the door and we're told that we had to evacuate within the week. Thankfully, we were given more time, but but there was no information from managing agents, developers, freeholders, no information from anybody that there was an issue in the first place. We just knew through word of mouth what happened to our neighbors.
Okay, and had you so put outside of your development, had you heard of this concept of decants, prohibitions, etc., across anywhere else in the country prior to you being personally involved?
No, not at all. So we had seen cladding go up at all across the country, and I've been involved with helping leaseholders take over the right to manage. So there were quite a lot of considerations that they had around fire safety and getting their EWS1 certificate, but I hadn't heard anything about having to leave your home.
Okay, no, that's both good and bad, but hopefully this sort of activity will raise awareness for people that it is at least a possibility, and hopefully one that even still is quite a remote possibility statistically. So just on the powers of prohibition, this again is one that I'm often asked, and who can do this and how do they do it, etc. There's sort of three categories. One of them that I'll deal with first isn't a legal power, but it's one of that does happen, which is what I would sort of call a voluntary prohibition, which is we've identified problems with your building and we need to ask you to move out, and we will manage the process, etc., etc. And that's often done by managing agents and registered providers, etc. And then from a legal perspective, there are two ways to do it that I'm aware of. One is the local authority under the Building Act, which is more typically to do with a structural issue within a building or a dangerous structure. And then the other one is the Fire and Rescue Service under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. Again, so really these are sort of last resorts where notices of deficiency, etc., won't work. We need to either get some or all of the building decanted or prohibited. Sometimes there's partial prohibitions where, for example, they might say the top 2 stories of a 9-story building need to be prohibited because of whatever reason, and then sometimes it applies to the whole building. But these are, you must not cross the threshold kind of powers, as opposed to being less formal, as I talked about before. What is interesting, and I think quite often misunderstood, although the building safety regulator has powers of prohibition in the earlier gateways, so you must not carry on building or you need to stop work or whatever, they don't have direct powers of prohibition in occupation. So what tends to happen, and this is why I was talking about the relationship between the building assessment certificate process refusal and whether there's prohibitions, the way that it would work is if through the back process it's identified that potentially there is an intolerable risk level for residents in a particular building, then the regulator would lean on the Fire and Rescue Service and the local authority to potentially prohibit occupation of the building through them, rather than the building safety regulator directly prohibit and making an order to prohibit the building. They don't have the legal powers to do it, which to me does seem a bit strange. But that's where we are. So I think, but typically under the MDT multidisciplinary team model, the local Fire and Rescue Service would have been or should have been involved anyway, probably local authority building control. So it shouldn't be a surprise that that building gets to a judgment where the back is refused. So they should, in theory, all work together seamlessly and achieve an outcome which keeps residents safe. But whether that power, and again, Mel, with your particular prohibition, was that the Fire and Rescue Service that actually legally prohibited the building, or was it a voluntary?
It was the Fire and Rescue Service, so Hampshire and Isle of Wight, and it was a prohibition, and then it was downgraded. But the prohibition was there to get everybody out of their properties. Right.
So the prohibition's now been lifted.
Yes. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what it went to, but the prohibition was very short term, just to get everybody out of the building and legally enforce the moving of everybody.
Yeah. Okay. We can maybe take some questions on that a bit later on. So that's good. How big is the problem? Again, this is starting to become hotly disputed. I will go with what I can verify. I'm not keen on the trying to infer from various enforcement registers, of which local authorities don't have enforcement registers. So again, if we look at structural prohibitions, if they're done by the local authority, then they don't appear on enforcement registers anyway, generally. Fire services sort of do, but again, it's very difficult to infer what actually happens. So for the moment, until I find a better method, I will stick with the sourcing from news articles. So on our prohibition register, which has been running since April 2021, but looks back to the 17th or 18th of June 2017, for obvious reasons, day after Grenfell. We're looking at just over 14,000 residents that we think approximately have been prohibited or evacuated, decanted from their homes. What we're not bringing in is building X had a fire and everybody spent the night in a sports hall and then went back the next day. We're looking at the structural, this building can no longer be occupied for a significant period of time. So there is a bit of a bar. And effectively now, I think it's about 54, 55 individual blocks or developments across the country that have suffered that fate. And again, anybody on the call or watching this on playback, if you ever come across or see a citable lead in terms of a building that's popped up that you're aware of that's been decanted or prohibited, please let me know. We'll validate it, check it, and then it will go onto the register. And then this register gets shared. It gets shared on our website constantly. It's constantly updated, shared on social media, and the press look at it as well because they want to understand the shape of what's going on. And the government as well look at this, and they've called about this data. So it's quite interesting to interact with. It's not perfect, but I think it gives a good indication of what the trends around prohibition are. And if anybody has a more reliable way of sourcing this data, please, again, do let me know your thoughts, because we do want to make this as accurate a picture as possible of what's going on across the country. Mel, what was, obviously you've looked at this and you've seen your building on here, but what were your thoughts when you first saw this in terms of the date distribution and the geographical areas and all that sort of stuff?
So I think that one of the biggest highlights is obviously with any tracker, a lot of this is retrospective. So after the fact, after it's happened. And obviously the biggest gap is what's happening between the moment that somebody knows that, okay, this building is going to be decanted to the time that it actually is. And the process between that, what I'm learning is the residents are told at the very last minute, and a lot more could be done to mitigate the anxiety and stress that happens, because they have to go through the fire services, as you mentioned. They have to make sure that everything's checked. I mean, I've spoken to the agents who help manage the decants of the accommodation for this, and they know several months in advance. And so the fact that everything's being prepared for the move and the works, etc., and the residents not getting an appropriate warning, I think is probably the biggest area that I would like to support, because it's not a fun experience.
No. And I must admit, I think I mentioned it earlier, but I just feel really guilty about this. I'm sort of staring here at a spreadsheet, and I listened to a podcast the other day with Professor Anna Minton, who's a housing professor, was talking in relation to sort of planning and new build about spreadsheet thinking. And I must admit, I think we probably all get guilty, or could all be guilty of that, where we look at these big spreadsheets, and I look at this one and I'm looking at each line and the numbers, and that line that's got 60 on it, 60 residents, for example, you think, well, that's probably 20 dwellings of, it's people's lives, it's people's hopes and dreams, etc., and they're another line on the spreadsheet. You know, we insert a row, we add another line into the spreadsheet, but actually that's everyone's world being turned upside down. And you're right, it is after the event. You know, I in my pipeline, if you like, of things to keep an eye on, there are a number of large buildings and developments that I know are going to make it onto this list at some point within the next few months, be that informally or formally. You know, this list will grow, the spreadsheet will grow, and there are people at the, you know, on each line there are people. You know, you're one of them, and I think it's really important that, you know, you're giving voice to those people to sort of say, well, this is what it actually feels like. Because I must admit, I've never had the resource or the time or anything to actually go and try and find people in each of these buildings to say, well, what happened to you? You know, this happened. You're on my spreadsheet from 3 or 4 years ago. What happened next? And I think that's a failing again of policymakers, of media, etc., that they haven't bothered to go and try and track people down. It's all very newsworthy at the moment. You know, the day that everybody's being kicked out, you know, get the cameras there, make a big thing of it. But actually, 2-3 years down the line, what happened? What can we learn? What can be improved? So, you know, I think that's really important. And it brings me on to the humanity point. I keep banging on about this. We've ever since Richard and I set the business up, we set 3 core values of commitment, humanity, and integrity. So if we focus on the H for humanity in the middle, and say, okay, well, how does that fit with kicking people out of their homes? And, you know, we probably all agree not well, but if it's got to be done, let's do it in a human way, not just in a spreadsheet driven, financially driven kind of way. And it got me thinking about Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, and all those back, but at the base of that, you know, the physiological, you know, shelter, safety and security, you know, health, property, etc. So just look at the base of that triangle a minute and relate that to what we're talking about today. This is fundamental to what we are as human beings, you know, how we operate. But if the conversation is about fire engineers and scaffolding and remediation funding and, you know, waiting watch, etc., I just wonder how much time we're spending actually thinking about the base of that triangle, those first 2 stripes. I mean, how does this relate to what you experience, Mel?
Well, I think the property industry in general it seems to have a different level of rules. And I say that because if you bought a car and you knew that it had the potential to explode or it wasn't built properly, consumer law means that you can get a refund. There's a recall, people put it right. Now, in this instance, when, as you've rightfully pointed out, security, safety, and your environment where you sleep at night and your home is the basic kind of structure of how we feel safe and secure, when you're disrupting that without considering the approach for each of the individuals and the needs that they may have, of whether or not they might be elderly or they have young children or they're looking after, they're a carer, all of these components, if you're not approaching the humans involved, I can't, and that, I'm sure it's not done on purpose, but the exclusion is, I think, is gross negligence to not consider the human impact. When you just think of, if you have a bad sleep and, you know, the struggle that you have in the next few days at work. I mean, these are people who are supposed to get up, go to work, contribute to society, not fall apart. And I haven't had one phone call from anybody throughout this process to see if I'm okay. And I guess that's where I see the gap. And I would really, I mean, and so I just want to give credit to, I have been speaking with a consulting firm who has a developer that needs to decant and has given the entire project over to this company, and they've reached out, and we're in discussions about how do we let the residents know as soon as possible and give them the support they need and have the conversation of what special requirements they may have. And we know it's not a fun experience. We know it must be done. But if people feel like they're being heard and cared for, I can guarantee their reaction to this entire situation will be totally different to somebody who it's feel like they're just a piece of furniture that's also being moved out into storage and having to fend for themselves.
Yeah, and I think, you know, at this point, having also been involved in this process from the other side of the fence in terms of working with organisations that have either got to do this or consider doing this, there is a very real human impact on that side as well, in terms of having to plan this, and typically it's not the people that are doing this. This isn't, you know, their strong suit in terms of doing the sort of the customer interface piece in this way. So it's quite a technically driven conversation, and it's stressful for them as well. So I think the overall process is massively stressful. Then you throw in media attention, etc., etc. Lack of resourcing. So I think where we're landing, I think where we've talked and said is that there really is a role, and I've got a slide about it in a minute, so I don't want to preempt that, but there is definitely a role for the human piece. You know, there's a reason why in employment we have human resources people. You know, they do the cuddly or whatever, and you know, they've got to follow the law, but also they need to keep some humanity in the process, where it might be, for example, if you let the accountants run the show, it might be more of a financially driven decision-making process. So it's about that team. And what I thought I'd contrast that with, and you mentioned 6 hours, but actually one of the things I did with the BBC, one of the case studies they had was in Worcester, where if we consider the impact of having your life turned upside down or the rug pulled from under you or whatever from a resident's perspective, and I'll just advance the slide now. I haven't validated this, but this is what they told the BBC, that they were given 30 minutes to leave. Now, I haven't validated that. It may or may not have been 30 minutes or whatever, but if whether it's 30 minutes, 3 hours a day, a week, or whatever, just for everybody, imagine for a minute being told that pack up, go, you know, you need to leave your home. Just imagine if you compound that with not really knowing where you're going to go, not giving you any work, etc., etc. So I think there will be times where it does have to happen in a hurry. I would say probably in a lot of cases there could be more preamble and warning given that there is a possibility, but I think that also has implications as well in terms of speculation of what might happen. So it is a really difficult, and maybe when we're in the Q&A, maybe we can get some thoughts from the audience that are on the side, would be on the side of the fence of having to sort of issue this notification and manage this process to residents potentially. Maybe some of them already have, but that would be good to know. But yeah, I mean, just I think if everybody always asked about what is the human impact of what we're about to do, is there a better way of us doing it, are we adequately resourced to manage this process, I think they would be good questions to be asked if they're not being asked at the moment. One of the other conversations we've had is this whole like for like thing. So if we equate your apartment to a car, Mel, so sort of said it's a nice shiny 2-year-old Mercedes, it's got all the bells and whistles or whatever, and then you're moved out. What my understanding from our conversation is that everyone said, well, have one of them, it's a house, isn't it? In the same way that you could say that's a car. How did that actually happen? And what was the expectation of the accommodation provider in terms of what you would or wouldn't accept, and what your resident, your neighbours would accept?
So a couple of things on this. Imagine if you're the developer or the housing association and you believe you're giving the Mercedes to the resident because the prices you're paying warrant that, then you can't fault the people who are you know, trusting the agents, etc., to give like for like. What's happening is that there's so much money being made in the middle part of servicing and, you know, going out and sourcing the accommodation, or 3-star hotels being priced at 5-star hotels, that it's the resident who is being moved into, who has very little control over where they go, what the actual environment is like. And yes, I mean, that little car looks really nice compared to some of the situations that I have seen residents put into as an alternative to their marina facing apartments. But I think a lot of the translation, it's not so much in the intention from the providers who are organizing this. It's a lot of times the amount of money that's being made and the people who are benefiting from the urgent need to place people into homes. And I've just seen the commissions and the inflation in pricing, and I think that in itself is criminal.
And we look at the recent announcements of one of the very large developers sort of announced over £1 billion now that they've provisioned for building safety remediation, and you know, the costs of relocating residents would probably fall within that budget. So, and that's probably going to be recovered in part from the supply chain at some point in the future. It's going to go through the courts, etc., etc. So, you know, quite where that bill will land is another point. But ultimately, if you've got that person in the middle there that's taking that huge amount of margin out, you know, either you do like for like and you end up with paying 2 or 3 times the market rate, or as you say, you get the sort of shrinkflation of the apartment, and suddenly you're living in a shoebox staring at a brick wall. Which I guess one person could argue, well, it's a house, isn't it? It's a roof over your head. But if that's the next year, 2, 3 years, however long, living in that way, you know, that isn't fair and it's not human, I would say. So again, interesting. And I think you're also mentioning about the issues around hotels as well, of people not knowing where they were going to be sleeping the next day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so in our situation, I want to say that I've seen stories where people aren't getting support and they're not getting accommodation provided for them. They're not getting financial assistance. And so I will continue to say that I'm very grateful that we have had some support. And even if it hasn't been the personal side, the hotels that they were wanting to put us into, because they weren't going to find a like for mine or some of my neighbors' apartments, I was trying to organize a local hotel that I knew of that at the same rate that they were charging for a Premier Inn, which was £180 a night, and was refused to go into the one that I had also negotiated for that same rate because the provider in question wasn't getting commission from that hotel. And so all of a sudden it is only about the money, which is, and then obviously local landlords missing out on being able to provide serviced accommodation to their neighbors. Yeah, it just seemed pretty unfair from both sides. And then whilst this was happening, neighbors are either yelling and screaming as they're walking around or breaking down in tears. And because there's so many middle people, not having one person that they could talk to find answers, it was and then obviously the well-being side of things, it was a lot for people to deal with.
Overwhelming. And one of the points that I've always wondered, and you know, I have no answer for, is that, you know, the what will be the impact on life expectancy, for example, for thousands of people. Or if we don't just look at decants, we look at the building sector. You know, we look at people living through remediations or being stuck for 5, 6, 7, 8 years in not being able to sell or buy or whatever. That overall toxic, corrosive nature of the building safety crisis, and whether that risk actually outweighs the risk to life from fire or structural collapse. I don't think that third aspect has ever really been quantified. I don't know whether it can be. It's beyond my skill set, but I do always think that it was once described to me as people that throwing themselves off a balcony because of the financial ruin or the emotional ruin, as opposed to there being a fire in the flat behind them or whatever it is. And it's probably the hidden impact. I think one of the hidden impacts of this crisis is what will the long-term effect of this be, bearing in mind we're already sort of over 8 years into this process, and there is no real end in sight to it at the moment for another at least 5-10 years probably. I don't know what have you seen with your sort of KindStay hat, and what have you seen from the therapists you've been talking to, or what are their thoughts on it, sort of looking at this from the outside in, but through a psychological lens?
So I built KindStay and the Wellness Hub in particular, not based on clinical support, because I really that differentiation is really important. The Wellness Hub is to help support people to build resilience and improve their mindset that in ways that help them cope with the situation that they're in. And it's when people don't feel like they're in control that they tend to become even more stressed and anxious, etc. So rather than getting them to, we acknowledge that this situation is a horrible situation to be in, but it's a necessary one. And we're encouraging you to join memberships to the gym, go for a walk, make sure that you're bringing your kids to the play center, anything you can to get out of the house, as well as the touch points of just how are you looking after yourself during all of this, and doing the things that you can. Now, you raised a really interesting point just before on, should you be moving people out of the homes? Now, I understand the desire to not have another Grenfell or another tragedy like that occur. And what came to mind was my grandfather during COVID and not being able to leave your house and feeling trapped. And I guess everybody can understand what that was like for them. Now imagine going into a totally different environment, and it may not be clean, or the standards may not be comfortable, and like, how do you cope with that? I think that when everybody goes on holiday, as lovely as it is to stay in a hotel, you always really enjoy coming back home and getting into your own bed and being in your familiar environment. So I think that it's just, as you said, a lot of these technical folks who are instructed to remediate and fix all of these issues, they're not paid or skilled to really consider the human aspect of it and the psychological effects. And I think that anybody who feels like they don't have control, whether it's where they live or how much they can leave their home, if they can, because a lot of these people will have disabilities. All of these factors, I'm not asking for a white glove service, a 5-star service for everybody. It's just making sure, a simple phone call. Are you okay, Matt? How are you coping with this? Have you had a look at some of the tools that are available? What are you doing to get out of the house? How are you looking after yourself? Reminding them that they're cared about. That is a very low cost, simple solution that makes sure that people feel cared and heard, and that they're not just totally forgotten about.
Yeah. I mean, one of the conversations we had, and I sort of put this slide up about how much is a life worth. That we can translate that into the cost of remediating a building. Okay, so it's going to cost X many million. There are Y number of people that live in the building or whatever. So there are value judgments being made, and there's standards in terms of where tolerability lies, etc. through PASs and all sorts of things. But ultimately, if you went to a company that was doing a decant and said, okay, right, well, do we agree we should pay some money to look after the people that are being disrupted? Yes, I do. It'd be very interesting to see where the line is drawn. Whereas, well, if that's £10 per person, yeah, I can live with that. But if it's £1,000 per person, that's too much. Where is that line? I don't think we can answer it, but I think it would be one that I would encourage every project to look at, and then also see. I'm not sure whether that would be an allowable project cost as well. That's the other point in terms of the way that the funding mechanisms work. So I think for a developer to say we're in for £1 billion anyway, so if it's 1.1 billion, but we manage our reputation, we do the right thing by people, I can understand that. But if it was going to the taxpayer for funding, whether that would be an allowable project cost, I don't know whether maybe there's somebody on the call that's far more sort of au fait with the funding streams than I am to say, well, would investing into well-being be a project cost in the way that you could make a decision, for example, rather than to wrap a building in scaffolding and sheeting for remediation, you could use mast climbers, which might be a bit more expensive, but you wouldn't have to wrap the building and the disruption would be lower, but it might be more expensive. So I think those value judgments are made, but I'm not sure whether they're made around how we invest in the well-being of residents, whether it's through a remediation or through a decant. But,
so imagine, this consulting firm that I'm talking to, they have a resident manager to manage this. The developer has already put a budget aside for a specific person to help manage the resident side of things. Let's say that was, I don't know, 100,000 a year, and you had 1,000 residents, and let's say every resident to be supported cost £100 per resident, so another 100,000. So let's say 200,000 when you've got 1,000 residents. The average serviced accommodation that's being paid for is £200 a night per property. I mean, you can't really compare about the costs, and then the time, how many resources are being used for the residents that are really demanding attention, and how much are they taking from the pot that you have. I mean, it's proven, whether it's in team performance, whether it's in the well-being of employees, happier people create less issues, they work better together, they're focused on the outcomes that you're trying to deliver. Things just naturally will pay off in the end anyway. I really think the financial aspect is so insignificant in comparison to the wider budget that it should be, why aren't you doing it, not how are we going to get the money for it?
I agree. And so that sort of leads us on to these sort of project roles. So I think there'll be lots of project roles within a remediation or a decant or whatever, or repairing the building. But principal contractors, project managers, principal designers, we all kind of know that these people are required either by law or good practice or whatever. But the one that I wanted to pose to everybody was this role of, let's call it the disruption manager or something like that. The person that does the type of thing you're talking about, that says, now whether that's a person, whether it's a company that it's outsourced to or whatever, but who is attending those project team meetings to advocate for the residents, that representation, if you like, that perhaps is not one of the residents, but is somebody that is acting on behalf of or advocating for, because it might be that for whatever reason you can't bring residents in, but again, that discussion about resident engagement there. But when those other people on the list are saying, well, let's do X, Y, and Z, who's the one putting their hand up and saying, well, hang on a minute, let's just think about that through the lens of actually living in this building or being a resident in this building or whatever. I haven't seen, and it probably does happen, but I haven't seen too much evidence of this being given the level of priority that it should be. And I think that certainly from the people like yourself and other people I've spoken to that have been through this process, none of them have pointed to anybody to me to say, like, actually that was done really well, this was really good practice, and although it was a terrible situation, it could have been a hell of a lot worse. I don't know, have you seen that, Melissa? I'm probably not, based on.
So they do have quite a few managing agents of developments are putting up their hands to say, we want to project manage this, we'll look after the residents, bearing in mind that managing agents don't necessarily have the best relationship with residents anyway, because they're constantly trying to get things done, and there's a little bit of friction there. And the costs that I've seen for what they're charging is, again, just another line item that helps. It's totally out compared to the work they do versus and the value they deliver to how much they're charging. I do not think that having managing agents, I'm going to go on the record for saying that they are probably the last option. A lot of these project teams bringing in, I mean, it's a great opportunity for organizations to think about how they can leverage the local councils. They've got welfare and well-being teams. How could they ensure that they're bringing in support if they don't have it to handle the human aspect? I do have ideas about, how to develop this role into someone that people can build trust with. And it also, not forgetting that it actually makes the developer probably sleep easier at night, not wondering if they're going to show up on the BBC with a whole bunch of complaints from residents that feel like they haven't been taken care of properly.
Yeah, that's always a consideration. So, conscious of time, I think we'll just tip over into questions. I mean, I think the first one, really, I mean, so Hillary's mentioned and Rich's had a go at answering it, but are there any hidden, so I mean, I think this is really a question for you, Melissa, right? So are there any hidden costs for the evacuee during and after the process, apart from the mental and emotional costs?
So we will be out of our flats until the end of 2027. We've already been told that. I opted not to take the serviced accommodation just because of this, of what I was seeing, and took a cash in lieu, as did some other residents. And I don't know if that's an option for people, but I mean, I've definitely spent a lot more than I would have if I was just in my own apartment, because technically I'm still moving around and haven't settled on a space yet. But for the most part, yes, food, accommodation. If you're not happy in your environment, hopefully this is where I really want to support people, but a lot of people might just go to the pub, eat out a lot. There's a lot of consequences, I would say, to not being in an environment where you can cook, store food, all of those things. Maybe you're spending more in transport because your kids have to go to school now further away. I think that there are definite financial aspects that we endure.
Yeah, I think I've seen one of the, obviously a lot more buildings are going through remediation, or they've had have questions over their safety, and one of the key impacts of that is around buying and selling, remortgaging, people moving on to from fixed rates onto a much higher variable rate, not being able to sell when they need to, etc. Now, I can only imagine that even if you could get around mortgages with a prohibited building, I'm pretty sure that nobody in their right mind would want to buy a flat in a prohibited building. So I would imagine that at the very minimum, even if you're compensated for, the cost is removed of living in that, in that flat, you've got alternative accommodation. Your asset value is at best stuck, I guess, for a couple of years before you could actually go on and resell that flat when it finally becomes occupiable again. So that could be a significant cost.
Yeah, so I was going to say, one of the number one things that any housing provider or developer should be considering is, how do you very quickly communicate the financial aspect, because where we are still paying service charges, the leaseholders are still paying service charges to the managing agent, which was already very high, and now they're not getting any of the services that they've paid for. The mortgage rates, as you said, are high. In building insurance is increasing because now they've got these huge risks attached. I think that there are some very serious financial aspects from managing the building that needs to be considered. And who pays the service charges? Should that be on the developer as well, because they're not able to use all of the facilities that they've paid for? That's a big question, but I think that if you start with that, and as you said, that middle person, the resident manager or the disruption manager, if they're able to communicate in layman's terms all of the technical work that's being done, all of the project management in simple, easy to understand terms that just inform the residents. It's the lack of information that I think creates a lot of anxiety and stress. Giving them a ton of information, especially around their financial burdens, is a really important part to consider.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. I think we've got time for a couple more. If anyone else wants to put their hand up if they've got a question or put something in the chat, we do have a couple of minutes. I mean, I hope it's been a useful discussion. I mean, certainly one that I'm far more used to having the technical conversations and how do we interpret the law, etc., etc. And there's one area that often comes up is I've been asked a number of times, okay, so what rights do people have when this happens to them? And I've really struggled to answer that question when journalists have asked it, what as an individual, what rights do you have? And again, I don't know whether there's anybody in the chat, and I can't really see anything explicit in terms of, a leaseholder, for example, has these specific rights to their building. If those rights are removed, this is the method of compensation. This is the requirement on the freeholder to provide alternative accommodation or whatever. I don't actually think that exists. I think we're relying on goodwill and reputation management.
I have spoken to a leasehold solicitor on this, and the developer is obliged to ensure that no financial loss is experienced from the leaseholder's perspective. But I don't know if that's just private. So I think that there does need to be clear communication on the legalities of what must be covered. But I have given access, my neighbors access to the legal obligations from a financial perspective. Nobody should be out of pocket for anything that they're having to do because of the situation, as well as they're covering lost income for rent. So they are holding to their side. But I guess what we're talking about is more the emotional and mental impact.
Yes, and I think there are a number of buildings that aren't covered by the developer contract as well. So this sort of conversation might be falling back onto taxpayer funding routes, for example, where there are cost limits. I mean, Zara's mentioned very interesting, but Zara's a conveyancing solicitor, who we know very well, that said nobody thought this would happen, and therefore it's not built into leases. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I know in commercial leases they have a thing called a rent assessor, where if the service can't be provided, then typically the rent assessor would kick in, and then you're off the hook for payments on the lease for service charges and rents, etc. But I don't think that's the same in residential leasehold. Also interesting to know where the insurers are falling into this, and are the insurers standing behind these costs, for example? It'd be quite clear, I think, if you had a significant fire in the building, then the likelihood is that you would trigger an insurance loss. But if it's just that the building is unoccupiable due to its fire resisting properties or its structural integrity or whatever, I'm not sure that there would be a policy that would sit behind that, and therefore there's nothing to claim on effectively unless there's some kind of defects warranty. Again, all interesting points.
So just really quickly on that, one of the blocks next to us, their insurance policy has tripled, and that's being passed on to the leaseholders. So if a building is unsafe, and the developers are fixing it, should it be the leaseholders who pay for the insurance premiums that have increased because of these safety defects? And the developer has said that they unequivocally will not pay for that. So, and I believe that the terminology for the no loss to the homeowner, it comes under the building safety legislation, not necessarily, definitely not the individual leases.
I think with the insurance one, having looked at this quite a bit before, I think rarely does an insurance company say, you know, you paid 20,000 last year, it's now 60,000 because of X. So there could be an argument that says, well, actually the market could have adjusted, the market could have hardened, for example, therefore the price. How do you unpick that insurance premium to say, of the 60,000 policy, 35,000 of it is related to the fact that the developer didn't build the building properly, and then some of it's to do with market sentiment, something's to do with whatever. So I think it's a very difficult one, but the reality is that all of the leaseholders are feeling that in the wallet because they're on the hook to pay the insurance premium.
Mm-hmm. And it's another opportunity, business opportunity for brokers or whomever to go out there and be speaking and trying to negotiate these, because you've got the people who are footing the bill really pained and motivated to move and act. And so, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for good to happen here. It's just, yeah, being on the right side, I guess.
There have been discussions before, and it didn't really get off the blocks properly in terms of it actually delivering, but for a government-backed insurance pool for buildings impacted by the building safety crisis. But again, somebody has to drive this through and make it happen, and the state don't want to get involved, they don't want the liability, etc. But yes, ultimately, if you were paying £200 a month for your insurance premium and now it's £600 a month, and you're having to find 400 extra, and that's terrible in its own right, but doing that on a building that you don't even occupy or you're not allowed into, on a human level, again, just doesn't feel just. It may be legally correct, but it doesn't feel just. And yeah, my inclination would be, large developers, if you're doing these projects anyway, don't nickel and dime it. If you need to pick up the bill, but ultimately that will translate into many extra millions off their bottom line, I guess. So I can see why they're pushing back on it. I don't have an answer to that question. And on that note, we're done time-wise. It's exactly 1 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Please do come along to the next one on the 6th of November at midday. Thank you very much, Mel, for your time and attendance, and good luck with time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everybody for attending. It's been brilliant. Thank you for your questions and your input. And we will be sending out an email to everybody afterwards with a link to the presentation and a playback, so you can watch it all again and share it with your friends. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. And we will see you on the next one. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.